Hyperspace. Getting you from point A to point B in no time flat since 1977. But not no time flat. Hyperspace isn't teleportation, right? It does take some amount of time, but how much time? How fast can you go when traveling through hyperspace? This question has beset Star Wars writers for decades, and while most prefer to keep travel time vague and leave it up to speculation, others ignore the matter entirely, or worse, blatantly choose to contradict the few established rules we do know about it. But no matter how you slice it, hyperspace travel is and always will be a fundamental part of any story that takes place in the galaxy far, far away. So today we're going to take a look at how hyperspace travel has been established to work in the Star Wars galaxy, and then we're going to take a look at how those mechanics have been handled by Star Wars writers in each era of the franchise, beginning with the original trilogy, expanded universe, and the prequels, and then in part 2, despite my family's concern for my mental well-being, we will take a look at the Disney era and explore the many ways it has taken a massive acolyte all over that pre-established lore. But before we can talk about hyperspace travel, we should first take a look at the galaxy we're traveling in. This is the Star Wars galaxy. From one end to the other, it spans somewhere between 100 and 120,000 light years. That's a lot of light years. This particular map was originally published in the 2009 Star Wars Essential Atlas, and despite being released during the pre-Disney era, it remains the official canon map to this day, as you can see here in this poster released alongside The Mandalorian Season 2. I'm using the 2009 version because, well, it doesn't have all this clutter around the sides, and more importantly, we can clearly see these grid lines, which are used for geogalactic locating. For example, Dantooine is located in L4, and Jakku is located in I-13. This grid is the key for determining how far apart different systems are in the Star Wars galaxy. But Max, I hear you protest, how can something as massive as a galaxy be accurately represented on a simple 2D map? Well, my very young apprentice, this has been accounted for. In the Essential Atlas I mentioned earlier, the Star Wars galaxy is described as being discus, like a pancake, having a depth of only around 2,000 light years compared with a width, which is again over 100,000. So using everyone's favorite theorem, we know then that a distance of, say, 50,000 light years measured on this map would be accurate within a margin of less than 40 light years. There are, of course, a few systems that do exist outside of these boundaries, but the majority of inhabited systems do live within this slice of space. Of course, no matter where we're traveling in the galaxy, we can't just fly there in a straight line because, as we know,
traveling through hyperspace ain't like dusting crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and then end your trip real quick, wouldn't you?
So in order to avoid these dangers, we need to follow these paths called hyperspace lanes, which are basically pre-established highways and trade routes used to safely travel the galaxy. The winner of 2 victory points for longest road goes to this hyperspace lane called the Hydian Way. But there are thousands of hyperspace lanes connecting every known inhabited system with all the others. So in order to be precise when measuring distances on this map, we're going to need a way to follow these hyperspace lanes as closely as possible, which is why I have devised this highly scientific method for determining the true distance between systems. It's a very complicated mathematical formula, and I won't bore you with a complete breakdown here, but this should allow us to follow these hyperspace lanes as accurately as possible as we walk through this analysis. Now, before we embark on our first hyperspace journey, we're going to need the ability to actually enter hyperspace. What is hyperspace, you ask? Good question. I probably should have started with that. The truth is, we don't fully know. The best explanation I can gather is that hyperspace is some sort of fourth spatial dimension that exists parallel to ours and still interacts with ours, but in which you are able to move through space much, much faster. It's a bit ethereal and vague, but regardless of what this hyperspace dimension actually is, one thing's for sure. In order for us to enter it, we gotta go fast. Really fast. We need a hyperdrive. The first mention of a ship's hyperdrive is delivered by the one and only Captain Solo. He claims that the drive aboard the Falcon can make 0.5 past light speed. Now, those of you who paid attention in science class may already know that a mere 50% faster than the speed of light is really not that fast on a galactic scale. In fact, flying from Tatooine to Alderaan at only 1.5 times the speed of light would take the Falcon nearly 32,000 years, which is one heck of a SpongeBob time skip forward. Now, clearly, this line was just thrown into the script because it sounds science-y, but as is often the case, those tasked with expanding the universe took ownership over the concept and made something really cool out of it. In this case, we were given the hyperdrive class system, introduced by the West End Games TTRPG and later adopted by the EU novel writers in the 90s. The different hyperdrive classes are organized by an inverted number classification system. The lower the class number, the faster the hyperdrive. Light speed, according to this system, simply refers to the point at which you are flying fast enough that you enter the hyperspace dimension. And once you've entered the hyperspace dimension, the speed at which you're able to travel through it is determined by the class of hyperdrive with which your ship is equipped. In the tabletop game, this was implemented using a straight 2x multiplier. For example, a trip that would take a Class 1 hyperdrive 12 hours would take a Class 2 hyperdrive 24, a Class 3 36, and so on. Now, modifying your hyperdrive to be faster than a Class 1 is not technically legal, but if you're the scoundrel type who likes to make special modifications yourself, you might be able to tinker with it and squeeze out a bit more speed, maybe even enough to make 0.5. Now, as for how long it takes to travel system to system, this is where the information gets a bit more foggy. In the role-playing game, we are given this chart here that shows travel times, and depending on which edition of the rulebook you look at, you can see times as short as only a few hours if you're within the same sector, and as long as months if you're traveling across the galaxy. And these travel times are further affected by a number of other variables, most notably the class and state of maintenance of your hyperdrive, but also which specific hyperlanes lie between you and your destination. For example, your ship might be able to travel at its top speed on a well-known major trade route like the Hydian Way, but not nearly as fast on a backwater smuggling route, and even slower if your ship's navigcomputer has never flown that route before and has to plot the course for the first time. And that's not even taking into account any layovers along the way to rest and restock on food and supplies. And on top of that, if you want your crew to arrive in any sort of fighting state, you also can't push them to make that journey too fast. So while you might be able to make it from Wayland to Coruscant in 5 days at flank speed, the better strategy might be to take a full week to make the trip in order to have a fit and fighting ready force at the end. And there are other dangers lurking in hyperspace that could affect your journey as well. In one scene, while traveling alone in his X-Wing, Luke finds himself suddenly and violently yanked out of hyperspace by a massive Imperial interdictor cruiser. Now, I'll talk more about interdictor cruisers in part 2, but the long story short here is that they're designed to park alongside hyperlanes and generate massive planet-sized gravity wells, which would trigger a passing ship's proximity sensors and pull them out of hyperspace, after which tractor beams would be locked on and the helpless prey would be dragged straight into the waiting arms of the Empire. Now, Luke did manage to escape this trap and lightspeed away, but the stress it placed on his ship caused considerable damage, and it wasn't long before he found himself dropping back into real space with a broken X-Wing and thousands of light years between him and the nearest spaceport. Imagine the kind of terror that must have set in at that moment, staring out into the infinite emptiness as you realize that you are so incredibly alone. Those are the kind of dangers that lie in hyperspace travel. That's how real this galaxy can feel with competent writing. So there are lots of variables with hyperspace travel that can affect how long it takes to go from system to system. And these extra factors aren't a problem for us. In fact, I really like that they're there. It makes the whole system feel a lot more grounded and realistic. But in order for us to properly illustrate just how badly Disney fumbled the ball in this particular area, we are going to need to establish some sort of baseline for travel time. And for baselines, the best place to look is back at the beginning, to the very first time we ever witnessed a hyperspace jump in Star Wars, Tatooine to Alderaan. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this jump covers a distance of about 48,000 light years. Alderaan is, or was, I suppose, up here in the core worlds, while Tatooine is down here in the outer rim. Referencing our handy-dandy travel time chart, this trip between regions would take a ship with a Class 1 hyperdrive between 3 and 7 days. Now, we don't know exactly what path they took, but they're most likely traveling along this hyperspace lane called the Corellian Run, which, being a well-known major trade route, would put us on the faster end of this 3 to 7 day range. But accounting for the other travel time modifiers we discussed previously, we'll say that this trip would probably take close to 4 days on average. Of course, that's based on a ship with a Class 1 drive, which means that for the Falcon's 0.5, we chop that time in half, leaving us with a grand total trip time of 2 days. 2 days to fly 48,000-ish light years, which works out to about 24,000 light years per day, or 1,000 light years per hour. This is our baseline, which is great and all, and yes, the nice even numbers do make my OCD happy, thank you for asking, but the real question is, does this baseline fit with the movie's timeline of events? And does it fit with the other 2 original films as well? The short answer is yes, it absolutely does. For A New Hope, 2 days is perfectly reasonable for this trip. After they make the jump, we cut from the Falcon to the Death Star, and by the time we cut back, it's clear that a significant amount of time has passed. We know it's at least enough time for Luke and Ben to have established the beginnings of a master-apprentice relationship, and for Chewie to be bored enough that he'd be willing to play holochess with a couple of droids, but not so much time that we wouldn't still expect to see the standoffishness we get between Han and Chewie and Ben and Luke. 2 days in hyperspace checks both of these boxes perfectly. In Empire, Luke jumps from Hoth to Dagobah and then Dagobah to Bespin, both with a Class 1 hyperdrive, but with the Falcon limping along at sublight speeds for the entire movie, he has more than enough time to get where he's going. Return of the Jedi takes place almost entirely on Endor, but the few jumps we do see early on from the Rebel staging area outside of Sullust aren't given a time frame, and the 2 systems are close enough that they could have easily made the trip in a matter of hours, a day at most. So with the original trilogy fitting in snugly with this 1,000 light year per hour baseline, Hyperspace Line and the best parts of the expanded universe also being built around it, this is the standard that we'll be using to hold the rest of the series to. And I'm not just talking about the new stuff. As frustrating as it is to watch the Disney-era writers carelessly disregard these fundamental elements of world building for the sake of convenient plot progression, and we will be dissecting those issues in depth in part 2, we first have to be fair and acknowledge that this problem didn't start with Disney. It started with the prequels.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault.
The first time we hear the word hyperdrive spoken on film in over 2.5 decades is by Captain Allier of the Naboo. And right away, Captain Allier gives us some very interesting information. He says that the hyperdrive is leaking. What could the hyperdrive be leaking, you may wonder? Don't know. It's not leaking fuel. Hyperdrives don't have fuel. Ryan, they're reactor-based, operating on a substance called hypermatter to propel the ship into hyperspace. It couldn't be hypermatter that was leaking because the last time hypermatter leaked aboard a ship, there was no more ship. And besides, the hyperdrive is at least functional enough for a short jump. While Naboo and Tatooine are very close, they're still way too far apart to travel using only sublight engines. More likely then, this line is referencing some sort of coolant system for the hyperdrive reactor, and a leak in the cooling system could cause the hyperdrive to thermal throttle, causing them to be suddenly and violently yanked out of hyperspace, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home, just like what happened with Luke. But whether it's coolant that's leaking or something else, by the time they arrive on Tatooine, the hyperdrive is toast. Literally, it's shaped like a piece of toast. Why is it designed like that? The next mention of hyperdrives is when Qui-Gon attempts to buy a new one from Watto, who refers to the drive as a T-14. T-14 hyperdrives are kind of unique in that they are categorized as a class 1.8, which is essentially a little bit faster than a class 2 hyperdrive. This amuses me because it makes me think about whatever senator or royal family member who purchased this starship and how they must have paid extra for the class 1.8 hyperdrive just so they could brag to their rich friends about the class 1 part, conveniently forgetting to mention the 0.8. Now, I don't know why they'd be ashamed about having 1.8 though. From what I've been told, 1.8 is plenty. It's the perfect amount. Anyway, the last 2 hyperspace jumps we see in The Phantom Menace take our heroes from Tatooine to Coruscant and then Coruscant back to Naboo. There's not too much to say about these 2 jumps since there's no real time frame given, and anyway, who cares, because now it's time to talk about the Duel of the Fates. So the style of combat Maul is using here is called Form 7, which is known as Juyo, the ferocity form. And, oh, wait, this video is about hyperspace, not lightsaber combat. Whoops, my bad, I guess we'll have to save that for another video. Hopping over into Attack of the Clones then, we get a total of 9 hyperspace routes flown in this film, either shown or implied. Coruscant to Naboo, Coruscant to Kamino, Naboo to Tatooine, Kamino to Geonosis, Tatooine to Geonosis, Coruscant to Kamino to Geonosis, or maybe Kamino to Coruscant to Geonosis, or maybe they met in the middle, and finally Geonosis to Coruscant and Geonosis to Naboo. Now, there is a lot going on here, but nothing groundbreaking, and the movie is paced so slowly that you could honestly fly from one end of the galaxy to the other on bantha-back, and I'd believe you had enough time to do it. The only major convenience here is the timing of the clone army arriving on Geonosis right as our heroes are about to get killed, but it's not impossible that they could have arrived just then. And besides, the travel routes aren't really what I'm interested in from this film, it's the tech. Beginning with the hyperdrive ring. What a gorgeous piece of design work. It's simple but elegant, practical, but just so freaking cool. I love everything about this. The Delta 7 is already such a sleek and agile fighter, but then you pair it with this and suddenly you're at the top of Little Max's 2002 Christmas wish list. With how compact the Delta 7 is, I would have had major problems if the film tried to say that there was a full-on hyperdrive crammed in there somewhere, especially at this point in galactic history when hyperdrives are this big. So instead of the movie's designers just shrugging and saying, I don't know, Obi-Wan needs to go to this planet, so I guess there's a hyperdrive in his ship, they actually created something that's not only iconic but maintains the consistency of the world building. For all the prequels got wrong, this one they got absolutely right. Until they didn't. George, my dude, what is this? A solar sail hyperdrive? What concentration of death sticks were you smoking to think that solar sails would be an appropriate mode of transportation at all in this era? Let alone as a Bothan 11 hyperdrive, look how flimsy they are. The second you jump to hyperspace, they're going to be completely shredded. And even if they aren't, newsflash, there's no sun in hyperspace. So how in space are these sun-powered sails doing anything at all? And don't try and tell me that they're just used for sublight travel. That would be stupid enough, but no, they're definitely supposed to be hyperspace sails. See? The sails are open when he enters hyperspace outside of Geonosis, and they're still open when he exits hyperspace outside of Coruscant. This is so inordinately dumb, especially compared to the hyperdrive ring you just established earlier. And I get the aesthetic. Yeah, the Cape guy gets a cape for a ship, the Serrano people are haughty, blah blah blah. But the hyperdrive ring was so practical, and it was cool. This isn't cool, this is just dumb. Anyway, that brings us to Revenge of the Sith, and even though the first third of the movie takes place entirely on Coruscant, there's some twisted and tangled travel times near the end of the film that demand a bit of a closer look. So the first jump to hyperspace we see is when Obi-Wan flies from Coruscant to Utapau to confront General Grievous. Getting to Utapau is not the issue. Obi-Wan has plenty of time to get there, since again there's no real time frame provided. The issue arises after he defeats Grievous, and we're shown a series of events that appear to be happening simultaneously. First, Anakin bends the knee to old Palpy, who immediately sends him to the Jedi Temple to show his support for the pro-choice movement. Obi-Wan gets shot down by his troops, but is able to survive thanks to his handy-dandy Aquana breather. Yoda casually decapitates 2 living beings without even blinking an eye and heads for his escape pod. And finally, Senator Organa arrives at the Jedi Temple and utters the most iconic line in all of Star Wars.
And so it is.
Now, stick with me because this is where things get a little bit messy. Anakin leaves Coruscant and flies to Mustafar to eliminate the remaining Separatist leaders there. Assuming he used his Class 1 hyperdrive ring and using our travel time calculation, this puts Anakin's trip to Mustafar at about a 3.5 to 4 day flight, and he stays there until Padme and Obi-Wan arrive for the finale. But a lot happens between Anakin's arrival and Obi-Wan's. First, Senator Organa leaves the landing platform at the Jedi Temple and heads for the Tantive 4. Meanwhile, Yoda launches his escape pod into orbit over Kashyyyk, and Obi-Wan boards Grievous' ship and heads into space. All 3 of these events are shown to be happening at the same time. However, when Obi-Wan hails Senator Organa from Grievous' ship, the senator says that he has just picked up Master Yoda, and he tells Obi-Wan to rendezvous with them at their coordinates, which if he just picked up Master Yoda would be somewhere in the Kashyyyk system. But here's the thing, Obi-Wan is still in orbit over Utapau at this point, way down here, and Kashyyyk is way up here. That's almost 70,000 light years away. In Grievous' ship with a Class 2 hyperdrive, this should take over a week to complete. And then once he does make it there, the 3 of them still need to fly all the way back to Coruscant, where Obi-Wan has to spend time investigating the destruction of the temple with Yoda, then meet up with Padme and wait for her to make her 40th outfit change, and then he has to hide out in her ship and wait for her to fly all the way from Coruscant to Mustafar, which, as we established when Anakin made this flight, is a really long trip. That means from the time Obi-Wan left Utapau on Grievous' ship, flew to the Tantive 4, flew to Coruscant, investigated the temple, then flew to Mustafar on Padme's ship, that whole trip should have taken, 10 days or more? But the way the film plays out, this whole round trip for Obi-Wan, and it was a round trip, look how frustratingly close Utapau is to Mustafar, this whole round trip seems to have only taken a couple of hours, if that. And this brings me to something that's come up multiple times when I've debated this issue before, and it's the idea that hyperspace travel just moves at the speed of the plot. This, if I'm not mistaken, is actually a direct quote from the Lucasfilm story group, and it's been framed, at least in the discussions I've had, as the trump card that's meant to end the discussion. Who cares, right? It's sci-fi. Anything can be anything if the plot demands it. And listen, from a certain point of view, I get it. Why not just have your characters teleport around the galaxy as needed? That's so much easier than trying to be consistent with the world building of the universe your story is set in. You don't have to work as hard. And to be fair, even though we're definitely about to tear Disney a new one in part 2 for how they've handled this issue since taking over the franchise, it didn't start with them. As we just went over, Revenge of the Sith does not give 2 flying bantha patties about travel time or geography at all. And that's a real shame because when you can travel anywhere in a matter of moments, it really makes the galaxy feel claustrophobic and small. And believe me, I understand that pacing is a factor, and this movie was the grand finale, bringing decades worth of storytelling to a head. And it's racing. Oh boy, can you feel it racing, to get to that moment where the helmet clicks into place and the breathing starts, because yeah, it's a great moment. But if the journey to get there is convoluted and nonsensical, it dramatically undercuts the satisfaction of that moment. As cool as it is, you're left sort of confused, wondering, how did we get here? Of course, all the convoluted contrivances and conveniences constructed in Revenge of the Sith are insignificant next to the power of the cringe. As mentioned, this issue didn't begin with the Disney era of Star Wars, but it didn't have to continue either. The creative heads at the helm of this new era had a choice to make. On one hand, they could choose to ignore the matter entirely, to continue using hyperspace as a convenient way to move the plot along whenever they felt the need. And on the other hand, the opportunity to reel back in the extra slack George gave to such contrivances and conveniences in Revenge of the Sith, and once again ground the galaxy within its own set of rules, to make the galaxy feel rich and full and big again. So which did they choose?